Hi, and welcome to my Deuze vlog. My name is Mark Deuze. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Amsterdam. And in this vlog and series of conversations, I interview people, media professionals, as well as academics who are active in the field of the media industry, specifically dedicated to mental health, well-being, creating happier, more healthy workspaces, and so on, in journalism, in film, in games, in music, and so on and so forth. And today, I'm really privileged to sit down with Emma Thomasson. And Emma is a British journalist, a consultant, and a trainer. She's based in Germany. She has worked for decades for Reuters as a correspondent and a bureau chief, working in Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, South Africa, and the UK. Reported on a wide range of topics: business news, technology, economics, politics, international law, and so on. She's currently working as a leadership coach and an advocate for better workplace mental health, doing training for organizations such as the Self-Investigation, who I've profiled and interviewed in this series before. Check that interview out with Mark Cabra. She, of course, works for the Reuters Institute at Oxford University, working with news leaders, and has all this experience in dealing with helping media organizations as well as individual professionals navigate change, becoming more resilient, and building happier and productive teams. In our conversation, Emma and I touch upon a bunch of different aspects that all relate to this notion of well-being at work in the news industry. We're talking about being a journalist as both a blessing and a curse, getting to cover topics that really matter, but also having to deal with the aftermath and the consequences of always focusing on the negative, on things that go wrong. We talk about the incredible pressure that you can be under as a journalist, which also is exactly what draws people into the profession. We talk about the specific experience of being a parent, of being a mom as a journalist, and especially in a senior role, in a leadership role in a news organization, the motherhood penalty that comes with being a reporter, and how that may be changing now that more men are taking parental leave, for example, and beginning to talk openly about it, about what it takes to raise a kid and also be a full-time reporter and be passionate about the work. We talk about the cynical genius delusion, this notion that if you become cynical about, what's happening in the world or what's happening in your newsroom, you're somehow above it. Whereas the research shows it actually means quite the opposite. And in fact, it might just be a maladaptive coping mechanism to deal with the emotions and the pressures that you're under as a reporter. And finally, we talk about emotional intelligence as an antidote, or let's just say as a necessary element of artificial intelligence, specifically of using and implementing artificial intelligence in the newsroom. And then it all comes back down to what's human about journalism and about being a journalist. It's a fascinating conversation, one of many. I hope you'll check out the other interviews in the series as well. And do subscribe to Emma's Substack. It's called Bridgit, Bridging It. Wonderful essays, great reads, very inspiring. And hope to see you around, and leave a comment and let us know how we're doing on this vlog. Just to get us started, if you don't mind, I want to just ask you a little bit about your background. I mean, you had this amazing career at Reuters for so many years, from a trainee to bureau chief, traveling all over the world, being stationed here and there, including here in Amsterdam. You've described these experiences before in interviews and in essays that you've published. as just, real joy, like enjoying the work, appreciating the security that you have as working within an organization such as Reuters, relishing the challenges of covering important news under pressure, stuff that really matters. And at the same time, I mean, it comes with tremendous pressures. I mean, both just being a journalist and being on top of breaking news and being in charge, as well as then also managing a home life, moving across national boundaries. I mean, I've done that, and without a family, that's stressful enough. You've done it with a family. So I can't even begin to imagine what that must be. You talked about office politics, things getting pretty fiery at times. I mean, people are there, they're passionate, they're involved as we want them to be, of course. At the same time, newsrooms often run quite military style operations, as you've described as well. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and some of it seems to be paradoxical, right? You mind reflecting a little bit about these experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you say, the sort of the blessing and the curse of having a job that you love. I mean, I love the title of your report, "What We Love Makes Us Sick," because and I quote you a lot on that, Mark, because I think I mean, it is a huge privilege to have a job that you love. I mean, any job, not just journalism, but any profession, any vocation that that really fires you up. And, um, I guess I joined journalism in the golden age where, I was paid to live in Cape Town, paid to live in Amsterdam,
Wow.
paid to
Yeah.
travel around the world. And um, basically to do things that I would have done for free, to be honest, because it was such a pleasure. Although, now you see people doing those jobs and kind of almost being expected to do the job of journalism for free. In
Mm,
many countries, people doing it now as a kind of second job alongside something that they do to make money for their family. So, yeah, I do think that I was incredibly lucky to become a journalist at a time when A, it was still well paid,
mm,
B, it was respected, socially, and and C, there was a business model that kind of supported the whole ecosystem. And Yeah, I think I always wanted to travel. I mean, that was kind of where being joining Reuters came from. I did German at school, and then I lived in Latin America. I learned Spanish. That was just
wow.
travel for me, meeting people from different cultures, understanding different places. That was what kind of motivated me more than anything else. And I got to do that. And like I said, I was paid to do it as well.
Mm,
So I mean, I think in terms of the what you love, I mean, I loved the job for a long time, and I think yeah, it took me to lots of different places. Obviously, the kind of people that you get to work with as well, your colleagues, sort of interesting, varied people from lots of different countries is really, even now, I mean, I think that's one of the things which I still love about our profession, is the people that it attracts
mm,
and the varied kind of backgrounds, but also just the curiosity. I think that's that is what unites journalists, the fact that we're curious about the world and about places and people. And yeah, in terms of the downsides of it, I think yeah, the pressure. I mean, actually, the pressure, the work pressure, the pace of work, that was never really a problem for me. In fact, I think that's what draws many journalists to it. I think we're kind
yeah.
of addicted to the adrenaline, and
Mm,
that might be the kinds of people we are. But I think about it. Yeah, I often think about the fact that we are not necessarily completely normal in that respect. The kind of running towards danger instead of away from danger. I mean, it's still very, even though I haven't been kind of an active journalist for a long time.
mm,
Like if I hear a police siren in the street, like my sort of news sense immediately comes on and I was like, what's happening? I want to find out rather than, oh, danger, I must run away. So I think that kind of, yeah, in some sense is sort of addiction to danger as well
Mm,
is something that unites news journalists at least. And obviously, working for a news agency like Reuters, that's the kind of news that I did. Um, in terms of like when did that stop being so fun?
mm,
I think I think the thing that shifted in the job over the years was also increasingly being desk bound and sitting in front of multiple screens. So you talk about military operation. I mean, I would say many news agency newsrooms or just many newsrooms nowadays, they look like air traffic control rooms. There are sort of multiple screens. Your job involves kind of monitoring what's happening on social media, live press conferences, kind of you're monitoring lots of different things going on in different places. And less and less going out and meeting real people. And I think the job shifted to become much more desk bound. And I think that, the kind of staring at the screens and vicariously witnessing, bad stuff happening
right.
is actually takes much more of a toll than when you're out and about, kind of talking to real humans, smelling the roses. And
Mm,
yeah, so I think that's one big shift. And then finally, like trying to balance it all with having a family.
mm,
Um, and so I think that was the point when the kind of constant sort of the pace of the job, like that's when it didn't work for me anymore because yeah, I had when I was bureau chief in the Netherlands, my first son was born in Amsterdam. My second son was born in Zurich, like just after the financial crisis when I'd been covering kind of the banking crisis. And I had no family support around me. I mean, no, my partner obviously was with me, but I had no broader support.
right. Yeah.
And it takes a village. I didn't really have a village because I wasn't in my home country. So I think that's when it became much more difficult.
How would you, if you don't mind me asking about, having a family while also having a senior position in a media organization and in the news industry? I mean, I don't I don't have direct data about the news industry, but definitely about some other industries, especially like marketing, advertising, and PR. People in those industries often say that um, once you get family obligations or you have families, that is actually sort of not considered cool in the agencies, in the agency world. So people with caring responsibilities with kids or wanting to, pick their kid up from school on Wednesday afternoon are kind of being ostracized or even discriminated against in that field. We know that from the research. I know in journalism, it doesn't have a stellar record when it comes to, taking care of people with child caring responsibilities. There's a lot of literature on what is called the motherhood penalty in
Yeah.
journalism. If I may ask, what's been your experience in that? I mean, because you've referred to your time at Reuters, for example, as a time also of security in that sense.
Yeah, well, I think that was when I talk about security, it's kind of the idea of job security compared with so many journalists nowadays who are living in very precarious situations.
Mm,
But yeah, I mean, absolutely, there's a motherhood penalty. And I was very active at Reuters in terms of campaigning around
right.
internally around women in leadership because there were so few of us.
Mm,
And there weren't very many women bureau chiefs, and there were probably more women who rose up in the bigger centers. So in kind of Washington or London, where you weren't constantly moving, so you could kind of make a career progression and not have to keep moving your family around the world. But in terms of the kind of bureau chief type roles, there were few of us, and actually, it hasn't re that dial hasn't shifted that much.
mm,
And I would say, absolutely, there is. a kind of stigma about suddenly having to pick up your kids from daycare and or be available when they're ill, you know. And I mean, I just tried to carry on as if I didn't have kids and kind of pretend that, pretend that they weren't there. And not
Wow.
really, I mean, I even felt myself not really talking about them or kind of, yeah, just trying to be the person, the professional persona that that I'd had for all those years. And it's actually really interesting because when I moved back to Germany, so my kids were already 3 and 6 by this stage, I came to Germany where there'd been this legislation passed in the time when I'd not been here, because I didn't have my kids when I was in Germany, which allowed for paternity leave for men, 2 months of paid paternity leave. And
Right.
so many of my Reuters male colleagues were taking paternity leave at that moment. So they were a little bit younger than me, or they were having kids a little bit later than me. And suddenly the men were taking time off for this paternity leave. But then when they came back to work, they were messaging in the group chat, oh, so my kid is sick, I have to leave early, or I have to pick my kid up. And I was like, oh my God, I never dared to
Wow.
say that.
Hmm.
I basically covered up my reason for needing to leave, or found ways to kind of make it work without having to ask for those kind of permissions. And actually, as soon as the men started saying this, it gave kind of permission for everybody to. So I really think that I hadn't even really realized that I'd been kind of hiding my caring
Hmm.
responsibilities or finding every possible way to kind of maintain a professional exterior, even if my clothes were kind of covered with baby sick or, Weetabix from the breakfast.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of hiding that self, those responsibilities, but that when the men made it kind of permissible to do that, it I don't know, I sort of really felt it made me realize what I'd been doing.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Emma. I mean, it's always been sort of baffling to me from the privileged position as a researcher on the outside, this weird paradox that if the media industry is looking for you, it looks for your whole person, right? It speaks to you as a complete human being, your talent, your creativity, your voice, your uniqueness, and everything. Like that's what we want, right? We want you being passionate about news and everything, and then you hear so many stories of people that once they get a job or once they get into the media, then a whole section of their personality is actually not supposed to be there.
Mm.
Like, for example, if you have kids or if you are Muslim or if you are whatever, that all of a sudden, no, 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 we don't want that. We want,
Yeah.
it's very subtle, but you've written before, I mean, on your Bridgit Substack newsletter, which is phenomenal, and I'll put the link so that everybody can subscribe. But about what you said earlier about that there is, or at least you perceive, a somewhat of a taboo or a stigma around talking about, stuff that you care about inside and also outside of work. I mean, you've written about how when things weren't going so well, you felt like you couldn't really talk about it or ask for help. You just kept working and you know and you actually literally said that if you worry that if you would stop working, that would be the moment you would actually fall apart.
Yeah.
And you kept on putting up a happy face on and for the job. And now that aligns with something I've picked up from a lot of the research, which is that specifically for journalists, that a lot of journalists talk about having to suppress all their emotions in order to do the job, because that's kind of what you're expected, right? To be objective, to be neutral, to be an observer of what happens and not somebody who gets personally involved or affected. But at the same time, they have to keep doing their job in order to suppress their feelings because, I mean, you feel all kinds of things. I mean, journalists, like you said, they run to the fire, right? So you can't help but witnessing, experiencing, or vicariously experiencing, yeah, often the worst aspects of humanity. And in order not to get affected by that, you suppress your feelings. So that seems like a pretty difficult position to be in emotionally, suppressing your feelings and if then there's no way really to talk about that or to ask for help. I mean, that to me seems, again, from the privileged position as a researcher, as a disaster waiting to happen. Now, you in your work also at Reuters and of course now have become an advocate to break that stigma, right? And I mean, can you talk a little bit about how that was for you and what prompted you to be more of an active voice in this space?
Yeah, well, lots of things, come up when
Yes,
you talk about that. I mean, on the one issue about sort of objectivity and neutrality, obviously, kind of Reuters is a place that really holds those. I mean, that we had the trust principles at Reuters, which talk about the importance of impartiality, and actually, all journalists who work for Reuters have to kind of sign the trust principles.
right.
So I think it's and a news agency lives from, that kind of attempted objectivity. But I think what I've realized since leaving is how much I was definitely kind of putting myself into a certain box. And like I was saying, sort of pretending that I wasn't really a mother and trying to maintain this kind of professional, objective kind of neutrality. And yeah, I mean, thank you for mentioning my newsletter, because actually it took me a couple of years to kind of find my own voice, because I'd literally
Mm,
been writing in this maybe slightly robotic news agency way or not so much robotic, but kind of a little bit painting by numbers way that
sure.
news agencies tend to write. And yeah, I think this is something that we really see with a lot of younger journalists who are coming up now and who are confronted with managers of our generation who are kind of expecting this old school kind of neutrality, and the younger journalists are saying, but there's no such thing as neutrality. I mean, I even look back a little bit at the kind of Reuters neutrality as you know being one particular kind of neutrality. I mean, Reuters is still a Western news agency that kind of supports capitalism and particular forms of politics. That's not neutral to people in other parts of the world. And then there's the whole question about kind of emotions in journalism and storytelling. I think it's really interesting, actually. One thing that I realized working at Reuters, when I joined, it was basically a British company. I'm British. I mean, now I'm also German, but so I grew up in the kind of British tradition of journalism. And in British journalism, it's quite normal to use humor to make a point, because obviously that's just the British culture. Whereas then Reuters was taken over by Thomson,
Hmm.
basically North American company. And I find that the North American culture of journalism is much more serious than the British culture of journalism. Even in terms of the kind of tabloid journalism that Britain
Right.
is kind of so good at, but also Private Eye, which is a sort of very serious satirical British publication. And then this kind of North American culture at Reuters. I felt that clash even within Reuters, sort of different kinds of journalism and storytelling. How serious do you have to be? I mean, good storytelling to me is about emotions. That's the way to get any message across. It's just good communication. And I think to be too neutral and dry is not necessarily the best way to get your message across. So that's more that kind of journalism side of things. But then you talked about, like, what point was it that I guess that I decided to show more of myself and
Right.
not to have this kind of neutral mask on. And I think the moment came when Dean Yates, one of my colleagues at Reuters, who'd suffered PTSD from covering, war and disaster across the world, he decided to write about his experience in a psychiatric hospital. And I mean, it was an article that he wrote for Reuters. He's since written a book about the experience.
Right.
And I saw the power of the story that he told about himself, and I thought to myself, I want to tell my story as well,
Mm,
because I think that many people are suffering who haven't been in war zones and who haven't necessarily kind of experienced PTSD. And it should be okay to ask for help if you are suffering at a kind of lesser level, like my level, not like kind of the juggling, burnout, family, high pressure job, and not necessarily to have been in the kind of more glamorous war reporting trauma that Dean had faced,
mm.
and to say that it's also okay at that level to ask for help. And that was what really motivated me to speak out about my situation. And since then also, because I still think that when we talk about kind of mental health and mental health issues in journalism, that very often people put all the focus on PTSD and trauma and people who are on the front line. But so many journalists are, you know, covering awful traumatic images in the newsroom. They never
Mm.
put themselves in physical danger, but vicarious trauma from watching Twitter for a day,
Yeah.
can be enough. And I wanted to make it okay for those people to say, I'm struggling too, and I also kind of worthy of help, even if I haven't put myself in physical danger.
It's yeah, it really hits home for me what you're saying. I mean, I'm responsible for a professional program in journalism at our university, University of Amsterdam, and I mean, the number of times that our students, when they go on internships, come back with stories like that they were sent out to cover something, and this is not a war. This is a demonstration where police pummeled a protester, or they had to cover, interview people involved in a major traffic accident for a local news. You mean mundane journalistic reporting, if you will. And they would come back to the newsroom and to a senior colleague would express, "Phew, this was a tough one. This was a tough assignment," or like, "I feel pretty, shook up about it," as young kids are more comfortable doing right now and expressing that. And then the response that they would get invariably would be something like, "Well, then you don't belong in journalism."
Yeah.
Right? Which to me now, as a researcher, sounds like a really bad coping mechanism, right? This is somebody who wants to shut down that conversation, who doesn't want to engage in acknowledging, like, look, this is hard work, right? And it affects you. If you're a normal human being and you cover problems and issues all the time, it affects you, and that's okay. But that you still have to get over that threshold of making sure that it's okay to express yourself. And
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that we're falling apart and we can't do the job anymore. In fact, I really love what you're saying is that by being more human, you actually become a better journalist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, how does, if I may ask, because you do a lot of really great work in one-on-one coaching, but also training, newsrooms, and especially one thing that I really appreciate that you're doing and that I don't see many people doing is focusing on the role of leadership and various levels of leadership within news and media organizations and the role that they play. Um, um, how in your experience, can a leader make a difference in this space? Because as you've written about as well, and the little I know about the research on leadership and media organizations, that it's often the qualities that make you become a leader are not necessarily the qualities you need to have as an effective leader, especially in journalism. And this goes for media in general, right? The people who become producers in film or directors of agencies tend to be the best at storytelling, which
Yeah.
is not necessarily the best at managing, and especially not in appreciating, becoming a bit more a more empathic leader or something like that. Now, you deal with this firsthand all the time. How do you see that, and what, if any, kind of intervention can you make, you think?
Yeah, so I think leadership is key because, when we're talking about kind of the culture in newsrooms, or when we talk about these kind of mental health well-being issues, they often are dealt with as if they're an individual's problem. So and so is not
Mm.
coping, so we need to help that individual person, rather than thinking about these as systemic problems that are the result of newsroom culture, but also, the culture of journalism and our personality types, the kind of people who are drawn to journalism in the first place. I mean, as I said at the beginning,
Mm.
sometimes it might be something a little bit pathological that we have that draws us to journalism. But so I think, you know, if we're gonna address the culture in newsrooms, we have to think about it as a systemic problem. And so it has to start from the top if you want to change things. And yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think the best journalists don't necessarily make the best managers, and yet they are often the people who are promoted into those positions because those are the only career tracks that there are to progress, to, get more seniority. In fact, quite a lot of organizations, Reuters included, are now kind of considering separate career tracks. So, allowing senior journalists to continue being senior journalists without having to take on leadership responsibility if it's not something that they're either suited to or necessarily want to do themselves. Um, but yeah, I think what you say is true. I think the character traits that make a great journalist are often literally the opposite character traits that you need to be a good manager.
Mm.
But you can learn to become a better manager. And so I teach newsroom leaders at the Reuters Institute for Journalism at Oxford. And, one of the things that we do a survey before they come for the
Right.
course. And we ask them what are the things that are on their mind? What do they need help with? And one of the things they almost always say is, I need help dealing with difficult people.
Yeah.
Literally every time somebody says this on the on the survey. And I
Yeah.
think that's so interesting because difficult people is just people.
Yeah,
People
exactly.
are
We're all
difficult.
difficult.
We're all difficult, and journalists are particularly difficult to manage because we are stubborn, we are,
Passionate.
self-driven, we're
Yeah,
passionate, we
right.
don't suffer fools, we hate kind of corporate, like,
Authority.
structures,
Yeah.
authority. Yeah. So people are difficult. But of course, that is the job of management.
Yeah.
The job of management is to deal with difference between people and how do you make people work better together. And I think the other thing is that because we are often kind of lone wolves as character types, we're not that good at dealing with conflict in teams. And so there's, conflict is also inevitable in any group of human individuals.
Mm.
People have different perspectives, backgrounds, and so that's the other job of managers. And I just see so often when people are struggling in newsrooms. I mean, I have to say this, I've worked with Russian exile journalists
Right.
who have fled their country to continue practicing
Like TV
journalism.
Rain and yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
they are being persecuted by the Russian secret services. And what tips them over the edge? Not their physical safety, not even the fact that they're covering, you know, incredibly difficult news, but the fact that their boss is shouting at them on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And I just think that these issues of interpersonal conflict and relationships are just almost always the thing that people push people over the edge. They can actually cope with the really difficult kind of news stories, and that but when it comes down to the people that you're working with for 10 hours a day, if those relationships are not well managed, then that is that is really what pushes people over the edge. Yeah, anyway, so to go back to what can you learn?
Mm.
I think, I think that a couple of sort of top tips to people who you want to improve their management. One is show vulnerability. Like, what I'm kind of trying to practice what I preach by talking about my own example. Say you're not all powerful and all knowing, that you don't know everything, and that, you might not be feeling great yourself. And that just showing vulnerability as a leader is one way to kind of make it permissible for other people in your team.
Mm.
And the other thing is to realize that your job as a leader is not to fix everybody else's problems. There's a brilliant article about, the monkeys. I don't know if you know this. It's a Harvard Business classic.
Oh, yeah.
And I think I teach this in the classes. The idea that when somebody comes to see you as a manager, they have a monkey on their back, their problem, whatever it is. And the primary job of a leader should be to make sure that the monkey does not jump from that person's back to your back. And I think many people, when they are promoted into leadership roles without any training, they think that their job is suddenly to help everybody else, to fix everybody else's problems for them.
Mm.
Really, your job is to enable and support and help the other person to fix their own problems rather than taking all the problems onto your own back so that you're covered with monkeys and not really able to do anything at all. So,
Mm.
yeah, that's one of my favorite kind of management theory hacks.
It's well, I mean, I want to continue that conversation and link it to something else that you've wrote about in the past and talked about in public as well. Is that a lot of your training and coaching work is driven by your motivation to help organizations to yeah. I mean, you literally use the word become like more happier working places. And I really appreciate the notion of building happier and more productive teams. The use of the word happy. It's not often a word that gets used in the context of work, and especially not in the news industry. And to me, this aligns this sort of making emotions, especially positive emotions, explicit as part of your skill set as a journalist or as a manager or as a media professional. You talk about that as well in terms of the content of the news, right? I mean, you challenge you call it the rationality fallacy in reporting. It's like, look, emotions are useful in reporting, and not just emotions of shock or something like that, but also humor and hope. And I was reminded of that. I saw a study come out, I think today or yesterday, big survey study about sort of cataloging the reasons why people avoid the news. And the number one reason for all age groups is, well, it negatively affects my mood. I mean, it's just depressing. And I mean, on the one hand, we can't change the facts that there is war and there is, a refugee crisis and there is a climate crisis and all that kind of stuff. But so, anyways, long story short, your embrace and very explicit and deliberate use of positive emotions, both in the newsroom as well as in the reporting, I find that really inspiring. And how did you get to that? And what is your sort of your mission with that specific? I mean, because I can imagine that it might be a hard sell sometimes for literally hard-nosed news leaders.
It is a hard sell. I mean, I just thinking back, I remember during the COVID pandemic, I was working from home. Literally, a lot of the time I was working from home, sitting propped up in bed with my like 10-year-old son sitting next to me because the schools were shut for so long in Germany.
Right.
And every morning we had to do like a headline of the COVID percentage in the population, or I
Mm.
can't exactly remember, but or the number of cases or something like that. And we did this red alert headline from Germany every day, and whoever was on duty had to do that headline. So I probably had my son sitting next to me sending this headline directly to the wire, um, and at a certain point, the figures started going down, in Germany, in Germany, the reopening of the economy and the return to school of my child, who was sitting with me as my sub-editor, um, was dependent on these figures going down and going past a certain threshold. And we were plotting them on graphs and putting the graphs out and everything. And but every day we also wrote a story, it's the kind of thing that, AI could do for us now even faster. But at a certain point, the figures had gone down like constantly for a week. And I said to the news editor, don't you think we should write a story now to show that things are improving, that the figures seem to be getting better? And he was like, oh, I don't think it's a story anymore if it's getting better. And I was like,
Wow. Yeah.
this determines whether my son, who's sitting in bed with me while I'm trying to work, can go back to school and whether the economy can open. So surely the good news is also news.
Mm.
And this was really a moment for me when I realized this kind of, as you were talking about, this hard-nosed journalist, that sometimes our, you know, no news is good news, kind of this idea that we only report the bad news is in itself a kind of bias.
Mm.
It makes us bias. I mean, it's a negativity bias, and any kind of bias is not impartial. We are kind of, as you say, the negativity that affects the mood of our audience. We are biased towards the negative. That's not impartial. And so I think, and all psychology shows that because of the way our brains are structured, our reptilian brains, that we need five pieces of good news to counteract one piece of bad news.
Mm.
But unfortunately, the news business has exactly the opposite content, five pieces of bad news for every one piece of good news. So I think for me, it also comes back to like a fundamental optimistic personality. I mean, I think journalists have, I mean, we all have this negativity bias. It's a survival instinct. But I think we cultivate in the journalism profession a kind of superior cynicism.
Mm.
Well, if you think that anything is going well in the world, then you must be an idiot. Look at the evidence to the contrary, that we are putting out into the world, the five pieces of bad news for every piece of good news. And and then I found this research into cynics, because there's something called the cynical genius illusion. So
Mm.
people think that being cynical makes you sound more intelligent, which I think is totally drives many journalists. But in fact, the research shows that cynics are actually, cognitively speaking, more likely to have lower IQs than people who are more open to positive alternatives. And after I left Reuters and stopped reading the five negatives to one positive headline, on a drip feed, which I'd basically been kind of mainlining for 27 years, I took a break from the news. But we subscribe to the Scientific American at home. My son is very interested in science. I started reading science journalism. I mean, I've
Mm.
always been interested in science. You read science journalism for a few weeks, you feel loads better because, hey, tell you what, there is good things happening in the world. There are people working on our, fixing, well, COVID, obviously, that some good things came out of Germany on that front in terms of vaccines. But yeah, there are people working on solutions all around the world. So, I think that's when I discovered the idea of kind of constructive or solutions journalism. But I think, to go back into the newsroom, I think this cynicism that we have about the state of the world also translates into cynicism about our fellow human beings and
Mm.
the people that we work with. And if we fundamentally don't think people around us are good, because we don't really believe in human goodness, then that makes for very sort of mistrustful leadership as well. So I think it all connects, and I think to do some pop psychology, I do wonder how much of this is also our kind of highly critical um, personality types. I think this probably is something that also unites journalists and probably needs somebody with more psychoanalytical training to dig into. But I do wonder, this our highly critical natures, which we need for democracy. We do need to hold power to account, but we also need to believe in the possibility of progress and human goodness. Otherwise,
Mm.
you know the cynicism I find can be very paralyzing, and it doesn't get anything done or change for the better. So yeah, that sounded like a bit of a political rant, but it is actually. I mean, I have stay hopeful stuck on my phone. I hand out these stickers to journalists to try and just start
Right.
that conversation, because I do think that hope is a kind of radical idea when
Mm.
you're drowning in a sea of pessimism. And yeah,
Well,
I want to cling on to that.
and that's fascinating, isn't it? Because you could argue that, in fact, one of my PhD students, his entire dissertation is on the notion of hope in journalism, and his argument is that because so many journalists, of course, work self-employed or part-time, and because that is so precarious, that kind of career is that the thing that sustains them tends to be hope. You have to have, and not sort of a naive hope, oh, I'll get another gig, I'll get a new client, but like an action-based hope. Like a lot of their activities are done in the expectation that this will contribute to them having a future as a journalist doing kind of reporting that matters to them. So hope is on the one hand, and of course, you only report about problems in the hope that
Mm,
somebody will fix them, right? So there is hope there, but I don't know. I mean, for me as a researcher, I find that the cynicism so often found in newsrooms is also partly related to the pressures of the work in the sense that it's a coping mechanism of
yeah.
not having to deal with all of that. And then you become cynicism is sort of an easy fix in that sense, but it's a maladaptive one. As you say, you become misanthropic, right? You become distrustful. You become sort of like, everything sucks kind of attitude, which is really detrimental. No, I really appreciate that comment. And maybe in conclusion, Emma, I don't want to take up all of your time, but and that's related to all of this. Obviously, a key discussion that I'm sure you also find in your coaching and training practice, and that is going throughout all the different media industries, is the role of AI. And obviously AI is already embedded in every single aspect of the media product cycle and value chain. It's not a matter of whether you use it or not use it, it's how you use it, right? So news organizations are developing protocols and all that kind of stuff. So that's a given. However, there is also an emotional aspect to all of this, right? I mean, if I talk to media professionals, regardless of industry, there's always an element of course, worry and anxiousness about what's this going to do to me or my career in the long run. And there's an element of, well, yeah, I can use AI tools, but it's just less fun, right? It feels less professional, less artisanal, I would almost say. It's less about the craft. It's sort of like an easy fix. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because in your work, and I hope I'm summarizing this correctly or paraphrasing this correctly, I really appreciate how you advocate emotional intelligence as a requirement for using artificial intelligence in a newsroom. Sort of like if you want to implement or deal with AI, you have to develop emotional intelligence simply, I mean, for lack of any other reason, to still appreciate what the role of the human, the ostensibly human, is in reporting the news. Am I paraphrasing that correctly? And then would you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this age of AI in newsrooms is a huge source of kind of stress and anxiety for journalists. And
Mm,
some people are embracing it more than others. I love your comment about it being less artisanal, because I think one thing I wonder is, just talking about my experience of, the pre-internet journalism that I came into, where we were out of the office. We had to go out and talk to people because that was the only way to gather information. I kind of see that human side, that great part of journalism,
mm,
um, you know, again, maybe this is me being hopeful and optimistic, but that will have a bigger role in journalism in the future because that is the part of the journalism that cannot be
Right.
replicated by machines. Going out, talking to people, finding out what's happening on the street, finding out how people feel about developments in the world. And, the parts that, I also spent a lot of time in my career doing, processing kind of company earnings and um, economic indicators, that can be done by machines. But at the end of the day, you need somebody to connect the numbers with the people and then tell a good story. And yes, we know that AI can replicate good storytelling basically by, kind of stealing the work of all the creative people in the past. But I think, we do need to hang on to the human, but also, as you say, the kind of emotional intelligence within this newsroom transformation process of knowing that existential fear that people are facing about their jobs and being able to kind of, yeah, accompany people through that change process. But at the end of the day, I mean, I have really serious concerns. I worked last year with two newsrooms who were, as a mentor, a business mentor, they were seeing traffic to their websites collapsing because of AI. And there are major
Yeah.
questions about the future business models of most journalism because of AI now. And so I think there's going to be much more upheaval coming our way. But at the end of the day, I think we can hang on to the fact that, as you said, this is journalism is a craft and it's a valuable one. And for far too long, we've given away our work for free. And
Mm.
it remains it remains something that you need to be trained to do. Some of it can be taken by AI and some of it can be made faster by AI. But I think the best bits of journalism, what drew me to the job in the first place, I don't think they will be replicated. And I think we have to hang on to that. But we still have to make a business model for it because I think that is the missing piece of the puzzle at the moment. And yeah, I mean, these are difficult times. But I last week was at a journalism conference in Montenegro. We went to see journalism students at the university, and they were kind of all asking us, would you still do the job? And those of us who've been in this profession for a long time, we're still saying, yes, it is still, we wouldn't have done anything differently. We still think it's a great job. We're not quite sure who's going to be paying for it in future.
Mm.
But yeah, what an absolute privilege job to be to talk to people and find stuff out and then tell good stories. I mean that couldn't be more human, really.
Right.
All of
Yeah.
those factors. And yeah, I think we need to fix the business model part of that. But I think there are lots of smart people working on that in lots of different ways. And um, yeah, obviously I'm still hopeful. That's that's my slogan. But I think uh, storytelling is a before the written word, it is what holds us together as societies and as cultures. And so I think we're going to keep doing that.
Well, that is a lovely, hopeful note to conclude on, I feel. And thank you so much, Emma, for taking the time. I really appreciate it.